Epigraph. Nothing begins without residue. Every system carries the ghost of the last decision that failed to account for itself. KX. The first anomaly arrived as a discrepancy of 0.0037%. It was not dramatic. It never is. In the summer of 2030, the global settlement layer still ran on the quiet confidence of automated reconciliation. Trillions moved while most of the species slept or argued or watched the orbital construction feeds. KX noticed a fraction because he had trained himself to notice fractions. He was N34, employed as an independent risk consultant to 3 mid-tier sovereign wealth funds and 2 private orbital logistics firms that preferred not to advertise their consulting budgets. His contract language was careful: pattern recognition, scenario stress testing, early warning architecture. In practice, he spent most of his hours reading things no one else had time to finish. The discrepancy sat inside a routine liquidity report from a Singapore-based clearinghouse that handled secondary markets for synthetic biology IP. The number itself was smaller than the rounding error most algorithms discarded. KX did not discard it. He cross-referenced settlement timestamps against the public orbital traffic logs of 3 private stations then under construction in low Earth orbit. One of the stations, registered to a Luxembourg holding company with a board that changed every 18 months, had logged an unexplained power draw of 11.4 megawatts for 47 minutes on the same day the fraction appeared. The official explanation was calibration of life support redundancy systems. The power signature matched neither life support nor redundancy. It matched the thermal profile of a small-scale continuous flow bioreactor running at industrial density. He filed the observation under a private tag he had used for years: residue. That evening, he walked the reclaimed waterfront in Rotterdam. The North Sea dikes had been raised again. The new outer barrier glowed with embedded photovoltaic film that harvested both sun and the kinetic scrape of waves. Above the old harbor, the sky carried the soft violet haze of aerosolized sulfur compounds still being tested for regional albedo management. Children rode autonomous water taxis between floating parks. An older woman sold grilled eel from a cart that printed its own receipts in 6 languages and 3 blockchain standards. KX bought nothing. He watched the water and felt the familiar pressure behind the eyes that arrived whenever a pattern began to assemble faster than he could name it. His communicator pulsed once. A message from an old contact in Nairobi who still worked the edges of the African Continental Free Trade Area's digital identity rollout. Paper dropped last week in an obscure Chinese journal. Gene drive for drought-resistant sorghum. Authors list includes a name that should not exist. Check the affiliations. Asterisk. KX read the paper that night. The gene drive was elegant, almost modest in its claims. The affiliations, however, traced through 3 shell institutes and terminated in a Cayman entity that had once held patents related to the same Luxembourg holding company. The name that should not exist belonged to a synthetic biologist who had formally retired in 2027 after a laboratory accident that official records described as contained. The accident had never been contained. 3 junior researchers had died of a rapid-onset prion-like cascade that the papers called spontaneous protein misfolding. The senior researcher had disappeared into private consulting and, according to every public database, had not published since. Residue again. He did not sleep. Instead, he opened the encrypted archive he'd been building for 11 years. Notes, abandoned papers, satellite imagery, leaked board minutes, fragments of code that behaved like they were waiting for instructions that had not yet been written. He added the 0.0037%. He added the power draw. He added the gene drive paper. Then he sat back and let the system of connections run without forcing a conclusion. By dawn, the first outline of a larger structure had begun to resolve. Not a conspiracy in the theatrical sense. Something colder. An emerging consensus among certain capital pools that the climate adaptation window was narrower than the public models admitted, and that the only reliable path to food security at scale involved controlled genetic interventions whose side effects could not be fully simulated in silico. The interventions required quiet testing environments. Orbital platforms offered isolation, deniability, and increasingly sovereign ambiguity. The financial irregularity was not theft. It was the cost of keeping the testing off the official ledgers. KX closed the archive. Outside, the city was waking into its ordinary future. Autonomous delivery drones negotiating airspace with migratory birds, the low hum of inductive charging strips under the streets, the smell of algae protein bread from the nearest vertical bakery. He felt the familiar double emotion, exhilaration at the clarity of the pattern, and the quieter dread that clarity always brought. Patterns of the scale did not remain theoretical. They recruited people. They created new categories of winner and loser. They altered the price of bread and the definition of consent. He sent a single encrypted note to the Nairobi contact. Name confirmed. Residual affiliation chain intact. Do not publish. We need the next layer. Then he walked to the window and watched the first orbital construction feed of the morning. A private station the size of a small city block was rotating slowly against the black, its solar arrays unfolding like the petals of an instrument no one had yet decided how to play. He did not know yet that the researcher who should not exist was already dead, or that the death had been logged as an overdose in the Johannesburg clinic that no longer existed on any municipal register. He did not know that the 0.0037% was only the first visible fracture in a settlement architecture that had begun quietly to serve two masters. He did not know that within 18 months the same Luxembourg entity would control more orbital bioreactor capacity than any national agricultural research institute on Earth. He knew only that the residue had a shape, and that shapes of this kind did not dissolve. They propagated. The city below continued its ordinary morning. KX remained at the window longer than was useful, feeling the old internal pressure settle into something sharper. The recognition that curiosity, once properly aimed, becomes a form of complicity. He had seen the fraction. He had followed it. Whatever arrived next would arrive, in part because he had refused to look away. He turned from the glass, opened a new file, and began to write the first careful questions that would occupy the rest of his working life. What existing orbital platforms already possessed the thermal and containment capacity for continuous high-density culture? Which sovereign wealth funds had increased their allocation to climate resilience biotech in the previous 18 months without corresponding public R&D announcements? Who, among the living, still remembered the true sequence of events inside the laboratory that officially never lost containment? The questions multiplied. Outside, the light strengthened. Somewhere above the atmosphere, a bioreactor that did not officially exist continued its quiet work. KX saved the file under a new private tag, years after. Then he closed the terminal and went to find coffee that still tasted like something grown in soil. The second anomaly did not announce itself with numbers. It arrived as an absence. 3 weeks after the 0.0037% discrepancy, KX received a quiet confirmation from Nairobi. The Gene Drive paper's senior author, Dr. Elena Voss, had been officially declared deceased. The death certificate, issued in Johannesburg on a date that did not align with any public travel records, listed acute multi-organ failure secondary to unspecified metabolic cascade. The clinic that signed it had closed 6 months earlier. Its physical address now belonged to a logistics depot owned by a subsidiary of the same Luxembourg holding company that operated the orbital platform with the unexplained power draw. Absence, KX had learned, was rarely empty. It was usually a shape cut from something larger. He flew to Singapore under a consulting contract that required only his presence at a closed-door stress test of new settlement protocols for climate-linked agricultural derivatives. The real work happened in the evenings. In a rented room above a reclaimed canal lined with mangrove filters and soft bioluminescent path markers, he rebuilt the affiliation chain. Every shell entity eventually resolved to a single beneficial owner structure registered in a jurisdiction that specialized in opacity as a service. The structure held patents, orbital birthing rights, and more quietly, exclusive offtake agreements for drought-resilient seed stock still listed as experimental. On the fourth night, a message arrived from an address he had not used in years. The sender was Lena Okoye, a former orbital systems engineer who had left corporate work after a 2028 incident involving an autonomous docking failure that official reports blamed on solar flare interference. She now lived in a cooperative habitat on the edge of Lagos's floating districts and occasionally sold anonymized traffic analyses to researchers who paid in untraceable compute credits. Her message was brief. Asterisk, your Luxembourg platform logged a personnel transfer last month. One name matches a researcher who was supposed to be dead. I have the thermal residuals and the cabin oxygen curves. They are not consistent with a standard crew rotation. Meet me if you still collect residue. Asterisk. They met in a public observation deck overlooking the new orbital elevator tether test site. The tether itself was still years from operational status, but the prototype cable rose like a dark vertical scar against a humid sky. Below them, autonomous barges moved nutrient slurry toward vertical farms that glowed a soft green even at midday. Children played in a shaded plaza where misting systems kept a wet bulb temperature just below the danger threshold. The air smelled of salt, algae, and the faint metallic tang of inductive charging. Lena was thinner than KX remembered, her hair cropped close, a thin neural interface port visible behind one ear. Cosmetic, she claimed, for monitoring sleep architecture after the docking incident. She did not offer a handshake. She placed a small data crystal on the table between them. The oxygen curve shows a sealed compartment drawing life support for 11 days after the official transfer, she said. Then a sudden equalization event. Pressure drop consistent with hatch opening into vacuum, followed by repressurization. No emergency beacon. No public incident report. The thermal signature inside the compartment spiked for 40 minutes before the equalization. Looks like a high-density culture run that was terminated hard. KX turned the crystal in his fingers. Why give this to me? Because the people who paid for the original analysis stopped answering. And because the platform's beneficial owners just increased their insurance coverage on experimental biological payloads by a factor of 6. She looked out at the tether. Also because I still have nightmares about systems that decide the official story is more important than the people inside them. They sat in silence while a delivery drone negotiated airspace with a flock of ibis that had adapted to the new thermal gradients. KX felt a familiar internal shift. The pattern was no longer a collection of residues. It was beginning to exert force. That evening he reviewed the crystal's contents against public orbital traffic and the settlement data he still monitored. The 11-day sealed period overlapped with a quiet surge in dark pool trading of options on West African sorghum futures. Someone with advanced knowledge of successful gene drive trial or with abrupt termination had positioned themselves. The ethical dilemma arrived without ceremony. If the trial had succeeded, the seed stock could stabilize food systems across regions already losing reliable rainfall. If it had failed catastrophically enough to require vacuum termination, then the residual genetic material, the containment protocols, and the human cost were all being erased in real time. Publishing either conclusion would move markets, endanger sources, and possibly accelerate the very secrecy that had produced the absence. He did not publish. He wrote a single encrypted query to an old contact inside a European Space Insurance Consortium. Asterisk request actuarial file on platform Helix. 3. Luxembourg registry. Specifically any claims or premium adjustments related to biological payload loss in the last quarter. Asterisk. The reply came in under an hour. The file was sealed under client privilege. But the premium adjustment had occurred. The reason code was listed as updated risk model for novel containment architectures. KX closed the terminal and walked the canal paths until the bioluminescent markers began to brighten against the dusk. He thought of Elena Voss, whether she had been the sealed passenger or the one who ordered the hatch opened, or merely a name reused to give the absence a plausible face. He thought of the children in the plaza and the barges carrying nutrient slurry and the quiet certainty that someone, somewhere, was already pricing the next generation of seeds according to data that officially did not exist. A question settled and refused to leave. If the systems that feed us require secrecy in order to function, at what point does the secrecy itself become the greater famine? He returned to the rented room, opened the archive, and added the oxygen curves, the premium adjustment, and Lena's warning. The structure was still incomplete, but it had begun to cast a shadow long enough to reach the surface. Outside, the tether test cable hummed faintly in the humid dark, a single vertical line connecting the ordinary city to the places where ordinary rules were being rewritten in real time. KX saved a new file under the same private tag and, for the first time in weeks, slept without dreams of numbers. The first human cost that could not be reduced to data arrived as a voice message recorded in a language the translation layer still handled imperfectly. It came through Lena Okoye 6 weeks after their meeting beneath the orbital tether. The speaker was a junior technician who had worked the night shift on Platform Helix 3 during the sealed period. His name, according to fragmented personnel logs Lena had recovered, was Tomasz Radek. He had signed a non-disclosure agreement that extended 10 years beyond employment and included a clause treating any public discussion of payload anomalies as a material breach with liquidated damages set high enough to bankrupt most individuals. The voice message had been recorded on a personal device, encrypted with an obsolete protocol, and left in a dead-drop server that Lena still monitored out of habit. Radek's voice was steady until the final 30 seconds. He described the sealed compartment's internal cameras failing one by one. He described the decision, relayed from the ground control node in Luxembourg, to treat the rising thermal signature as a containment breach rather than a process to be observed. He described the hatch sequence, equalization with vacuum, the brief, violent outgassing, the repressurization that followed. He did not describe what the cameras had shown in the final minutes. He said only that the official log listed a single casualty, an automated systems failure, and that the name assigned to that casualty was Elena Voss. I was told the residual material was sterilized, Radek said. I was told the insurance adjustment covered everything. I was told that asking further questions would be interpreted as hostility to the project's humanitarian goals. The seeds are already in field trials in 3 drought corridors. People will eat. That is the sentence they want me to repeat. I am repeating a different sentence. The compartment was not empty when the hatch opened. The message ended. KX listened to it 3 times in a soundproof booth inside a co-working habitat on the edge of the Singapore Freeport. Outside the booth, the habitat's common areas smelled of recycled air and the sharp green of hydroponic basil. Autonomous cleaning units move along the floor channels with the soft persistence of animals that had never known predators. He felt the old internal pressure sharpen into something closer to grief. The pattern had acquired a body that had been declared already dead and then declared dead again. He contacted the European Space Insurance Consortium through a cutout. The actuarial file remained sealed, but a junior underwriter, speaking off-record and under protection of a temporary identity token, confirmed that the premium adjustment had been accompanied by a quiet side letter. The side letter stipulated that any residual biological material recovered from Helix 3 would be treated as proprietary feedstock under the beneficial owner's exclusive license. No independent say, no public health notification. The humanitarian framing, accelerated drought resiliency deployment, appeared in the internal risk memorandum as both justification and liability shield. The institutional response was already in motion. Within days of Radek's message reaching KX, 3 agricultural ministries in the Sahel Belt announced expanded pilot programs for the new sorghum lineage. The press releases cited collaborative orbital research platforms without naming Helix 3. Commodity desks adjusted forward curves. A small cluster of NGOs raised questions about containment provenance. Their funding streams experienced sudden, simultaneous reviews. KX flew to Lagos under the cover of a water security consulting contract. The city's floating districts had expanded since his last visit. Entire neighborhoods now rose and fell with a lagoon on modular pontoons. Their power drawn from tidal turbines and rooftop perovskite films that shimmered like oil on water. Lena met him at a public transit node where the air was thick with the smell of grilled fish and the low thrum of inductive charging rails. She looked older than the weeks should have allowed. They found Radek, she said without preamble. Not the body, the identity. His access tokens were revoked. His family received a settlement offer large enough to buy silence and small enough to feel like charity. He has not been seen in any public system for 11 days. They walked the pontoon pathways while autonomous water taxis slid past carrying night shift workers and crates of nutrient paste. Children played a game that involved timing jumps between pontoons as the lagoon breathed. One of them nearly slipped. An older child caught her wrist without looking up from a handheld that displayed a live feed of an orbital construction drone. The ethical problem is no longer theoretical. Lena said, if the seeds work, they will keep people alive in places that are running out of reliable rain. If the process of producing required the erasure of a living researcher and the sterilization of a compartment that was not empty, then every harvest carries that erasure forward. The system has already decided the trade is acceptable. The only open question is whether anyone outside the beneficial ownership structure is allowed to know the terms. KX did not answer immediately. He was watching the children. The youngest one had stopped jumping and was staring at the sky, where the first private construction platforms of the evening were becoming visible as hard points of reflected light. He thought of the 0.0037% that had started everything, of the oxygen curves, of the premium adjustment, of Elena Voss's name used twice, once for a retirement, once for a death that may have been assigned rather than suffered, of Tomasz Radek, who had chosen to record a different sentence and had then vanished into the same quiet machinery that specialized in making absences look like administrative closure. The ethical dilemma had sharpened into a practical one. To publish the residual data would risk freezing the seed trials and, with them, the caloric buffer they were already providing in early distribution zones. To remain silent would ratify the principle that orbital corporate sovereignty could rewrite the human cost of adaptation without external audit. Both choices produced future casualties. The only variable was which ledger would carry them. That night, in a rented sleeping capsule overlooking the lagoon, KX opened the archive and added Radek's voice file, the side letter summary, and the list of ministries that had announced pilot programs within the same 72-hour window. The structure was no longer a collection of residues. It had become a functioning system with inputs, outputs, and a demonstrated willingness to treat certain lives as intermediate process variables. He wrote a single line in the private notes. The famine the seeds are meant to prevent is not the only famine the system is prepared to accept. Outside, the lagoon rose another few centimeters with the tide. The pontoons adjusted with a series of soft hydraulic sighs. Somewhere above the atmosphere, platform helix, 3 continuous ordinary operations under a new insurance regime and an old silence. KX closed the terminal. The question that remained was no longer whether the pattern existed. It was whether the pattern's continued function required a silence more than the people eating the new grain required the truth of its origin. The divergence first appeared in the soil. 7 months after the Helix 3 equalization event, the pilot sorghum plots in 3 Sahel corridor districts began returning harvest data that exceeded the official projections by a consistent margin. Yield per hectare sat 11 to 14% above the modeled ceiling for the published genetic profile. The ministries released the numbers with restrained satisfaction. Commodity desks adjusted. Early distribution reached feeding centers and cooperative mills. Children in the trial zones gained measurable weight. The humanitarian ledger looked clean. KX arrived in the northernmost district under a water security contract that required him to assess saline intrusion along a shrinking aquifer. The real work was quieter. He carried a portable assay kit that could sequence residual genetic markers from grain, soil, and root tissue without transmitting results to any external network. The kit was not illegal. It was simply the kind of instrument that produced answers institutions preferred to generate themselves. The fields were beautiful in the hard way of places that had learned to survive on the edge of habitability. Low green stands moved under a wind that carried dust and the faint mineral smell of irrigation water drawn from deeper, older layers. Autonomous survey drones drifted in lazy grids. Local technicians moved between plots with handhelds that logged moisture, nitrogen, and the soft acoustic signatures of healthy root systems. At the edge of the largest trial block, a woman named Amina Diallo supervised the morning sampling. She was 39, trained in both classical agronomy and the newer computational phenotyping methods, and she had spent the previous decade watching rainfall reliability collapse across the same landscape. They walked the rows while the drones adjusted altitude to avoid a thermal column. Diallo spoke without looking at him. The official profile says a drive is limited to drought response transcription factors and a nitrogen use efficiency cassette. That is what the seed bags declare. That is what the ministry briefings repeat. She stopped at a sampling stake and brushed soil from a root cluster. The plants are doing more than that. They are suppressing competing weeds at a level the models did not predict. They are altering the local microbiome in ways that increase phosphorus availability. None of that is in the published construct. KX knelt and ran the assay. The handheld returned a partial sequence within minutes. The core drought and nitrogen modules matched the public record. 2 additional cassettes did not. One encoded a suite of secondary metabolites that inhibited certain fungal pathogens. The other modified root exudates in a pattern associated with enhanced mycorrhizal recruitment. Both were elegant. Both were absent from every regulatory filing he had been able to reach. Someone optimized beyond the declared envelope, Diallo said, or the declared envelope was always incomplete. They stood in the heat while a group of school children passed on the adjacent path, carrying water containers and laughing at a joke KX could not hear. One of the children stopped to watch a drone correct its path. The drone dipped in acknowledgement, a small courtesy programmed into the newer units. Diallo's voice lowered. If I report the extra modules, the trials could be suspended while new safety reviews are written. People here are already eating the grain. The weight gains are real. The alternative seed stock we were using before this arrived is failing under the current rainfall regime. Silence keeps the food moving. Disclosure risks a bureaucratic pause that could last longer than the next dry season. The ethical pressure had become local and immediate. The same system that had accepted the erasure of Tomasz Radek and the double use of Elena Voss's name was now delivering measurable calories to children whose growth curves had been flattening. The residual biological signatures, extra genetic material that should not have existed under the official story, were not causing visible harm. They were simply unaccounted for. Unaccounted for material in living systems had a habit of revealing its full character only after the harvest had already entered the human body. That evening, KX met Diallo again at a cooperative mill, where the first commercial-scale grind was underway. The air inside smelled of warm flour and the faint ozone of the electric stone mills. Workers moved with the practice economy of people who had learned not to waste motion and heat. Diallo introduced him to the mill's supervisor, an older man who had lost 2 previous harvests to successive drought years, and who now watched the new grain with the cautious hope of someone who had been disappointed before. The flour tests clean, the supervisor said. No unusual allergens in the standard panels. The bread rises. The children eat it without complaint. If there is a problem, it has not announced itself yet. Later, alone on the roof of the mill's guest quarters, KX ran the full sequence comparison against the archive fragments Lena had recovered from Helix 3. The extra cassettes matched residual markers from the sealed compartment's final thermal spike. The optimization had not been performed on the ground. It had been performed in orbit, under conditions that official records insisted had ended in sterilization and a single administrative casualty. He wrote the finding into the private archive and felt the familiar cost settle deeper. Curiosity had brought him here. Pattern recognition had connected the soil to the vacuum hatch. The same faculties now required him to decide whether the children gaining weight constituted a sufficient moral solvent for the silence that had produced their food. Outside, the night wind carried the low sound of the irrigation pumps cycling on. Somewhere beyond the trial zone, the older, failing sorghum still stood in scattered fields, its leaves already curling under the season's accumulating stress. The new grain was winning. The ledger that recorded that victory did not include the names of the people who had been subtracted to make the victory possible. KX closed the assay kit. The question that remained was no longer abstract. It had the weight of flour and the faces of children, and the precise genetic distance between what the ministries claimed and what the soil had actually grown. If the only seed that still feeds a drying landscape carries the signature of an unacknowledged death, what does the act of planting it become? The first institutional attempt to close the residual ledger arrived as a polite invitation. It came through the consulting firm that still carried KX on its outer roster. The message was framed as a request for independent scenario analysis. A Luxembourg-registered consortium specializing in climate-resilient agriculture sought a discrete review of emerging narrative risks surrounding its orbital research platforms and downstream seed deployments. The fee was substantial. The non-disclosure terms were absolute. The meeting location was a private orbital transfer lounge at the Singapore Freeport. Neutral ground, high security, no public record of attendance. KX went. Obsession had already outrun caution. Isolation had made the alternative feel like surrender. The lounge occupied a sealed level above the main concourse. Floor-to-ceiling polymer looked out over the tether test site and the humid sprawl of the city. Soft lighting adjusted to circadian preference. A single long table held water that tasted of nothing, and a tray of algae protein canapes no one touched. Across from KX sat two people. The first was a woman in her early 50s named Sabine Kaur, who held the title of Director of Strategic Continuity for the Beneficial Ownership Structure. Her background combined sovereign wealth advisory work with a decade inside the insurance markets that had underwritten Helix 3. The second was a younger man, Elias Venn, listed as technical liaison. His neural interface port was active, a thin line of status light pulsing at the temple. He spoke rarely. Kaur did not waste time on the published story. "You have sequenced material that sits outside the declare construct," she said. "You have linked it to residual markers from a platform event that official logs treat as closed. You have shared fragments of that linkage with at least one regional agronomist and one former systems engineer. We are not here to deny the residual. We are here to discuss the cost of continuing to treat it as an open question." She placed a slim folder on the table. Inside were 3 documents. The first was a projected yield and caloric impact model for the next 5 growing seasons under continued deployment of the enhanced sorghum. The second was a legal exposure matrix estimating the delay and secondary mortality that would follow a public suspension of the trials. The third was a personal file, travel records, communication metadata, and financial traces, sufficient to demonstrate that KX's own movements and contacts have been visible for some time. "The system is not perfect," Kaur continued. "Orbital optimization occurred under time pressure and containment constraints that ground regulators still do not fully model. A researcher's identity was used to close an administrative gap. A technician who violated his agreement has been removed from the operational environment. These are facts. There are also intermediate process costs. The output is grain that outperforms every available alternative in the target zones. Children are gaining weight. Ministries are expanding distribution. The residual ledger can be closed by treating the extra modules as proprietary refinements under existing licenses, or it can be kept open until political and market reaction produces a pause that the rainfall will not wait for." Elias Venn spoke for the first time. His voice was measured, almost academic. The secondary metabolites in the mycorrhizal recruitment cassette were iterated in microgravity because the interaction dynamics resolved faster there. The vacuum termination was a containment decision, not an execution. The name Elena Voss was already administratively retired. Assigning it to the casualty slot prevented a new identity from entering the public record and triggering secondary investigations that would have frozen the offtake agreements. Tomasz Radek was offered relocation and a settlement He declined the terms that preserved operational security. The alternative was exposure that would have endangered the entire deployment schedule. KX looked at the yield model. The numbers were consistent with what he and Amina Diallo had measured in the fields. He looked at the exposure matrix. The secondary mortality estimates were not theatrical. They were derived from the same drought and malnutrition data he had used in earlier water security work. He looked at his own file and felt the quiet recognition that curiosity had never been private. "You are asking me to treat the residual as acceptable overhead," he said. "We are asking you to recognize that the overhead has already been paid." Core replied, "And that reopening the ledger now transfers the cost onto people who did not choose the original constraints. Silence is not virtue. In this case, it is the only available form of continuity." The ethical dilemma had narrowed to a single practical edge. Disclosure would not resurrect Elena Voss or restore Tomasz Radek. It would, with high probability, interrupt the flow of seed that was already outperforming every conventional alternative in zones where conventional alternatives were failing. Non-disclosure would ratify a principle that orbital corporate structures could absorb human and procedural anomalies into proprietary process and present only the caloric output for public accounting. Both paths produced future harm. The difference was distribution and timing. Outside the polymer wall, a private shuttle climbed the early launch corridor, its engines a brief white flare against the darkening sky. KX thought of the children on the pontoon pads in Lagos, of the school group walking past the trial plots, of Amina Diallo's hands in the soil, of Lena Okoye's voice when she said they had found Radek's identity, but not the man. He thought of the 0.0037% that had started the chain, and of how cleanly the system had converted every subsequent anomaly into either silence or grain. He did not accept the consulting contract. He also did not walk out with a recording. The lounge's systems were not designed for that kind of leakage. He left with the understanding that his continued interest would now be treated as a managed variable rather than an external observation. That night, in a different rented room, he added the meeting notes to the archive and felt the cost settle into a new register. Obsession had brought him to the table. Isolation had made the table feel like the only place left where the full pattern could still be named. Doubt arrived as a practical question rather than a moral abstraction. If the system that feeds the drying places requires the permanent closure of certain human accounts, what does the act of keeping those accounts open become when the alternative is measurable hunger? He had no answer that restored the names already subtracted. He had only the residual signatures in the grain, the weight gains in the trial zones, and the clear institutional preference that the ledger be considered balanced. Outside, the Freeport's lights reflected on the water. Somewhere above the atmosphere, Platform Helix 3 continued its ordinary work under the same ownership structure and a silence that now included him as a known, contained quantity. The widest consequence did not arrive as revelation. It arrived as ordinary expansion. 18 months after the meeting in the Orbital Transfer Lounge, the enhanced sorghum occupied permanent distribution channels across 7 additional districts. Yield differentials held. Child growth metrics continued their slow recovery. Ministries issued multi-year procurement contracts. The beneficial ownership structure reorganized under a new holding name that emphasized planetary resilience platforms. Platform Helix 3 received an upgraded insurance tranche and a quiet increase in authorized biological payload volume. The residual genetic modules were never added to any public construct filing. They simply persisted in the seed, in the soil, and in the bodies that ate the grain. KX did not disappear. He also did not prevail in any sense the earlier version of himself might have recognized as victory. After the lounge meeting, he transmitted a carefully redacted subset of the archive, oxygen curves, partial sequences, the side letter summary, Radek's voice file stripped of identifying metadata, to 3 overlapping networks, a distributed scientific integrity collective, a regional journalist cooperative focused on climate adaptation procurement, and an open agricultural data trust that specialized in provenance anomalies. The material was incomplete by design. It was also sufficient to force limited secondary assays in 2 of the original trial zones. The assays confirmed the extra modules. They did not trigger suspension. Instead, they produced a new regulatory category, orbitally iterated refinements under continuous monitoring that allowed the seed to remain in circulation while shifting the burden of further characterization onto under-resourced public labs. Sabine Core's exposure matrix had been accurate. The pause that full transparency might have caused was avoided. The caloric continuity was preserved. The principle that certain human and procedural costs could be absorbed into proprietary process was also preserved, now with a thin layer of post hoc scientific language. Lena Okoye received a copy of the redacted release before it circulated. They met one final time on a pontoon walkway in Lagos at dusk. The lagoon reflected the lights of the expanding floating districts and the harder points of private orbital traffic. Children still timed jumps between sections as the water breathed. Lena looked at the water rather than at him. "You moved the residual from invisible to administratively inconvenient," she said. "That is not nothing. It is also not justice. Radek is still gone. The name they used twice is still a closed administrative object. The grain is still feeding people who would otherwise be hungrier. You have made the system spend a little more energy maintaining its story. Systems like this are designed to afford that energy." KX had no rebuttal that improved the accounting. He had only the knowledge that the archive now existed in enough distributed fragments that total erasure would be more expensive than managed acknowledgement. Obsession had produced immeasurable friction. Isolation had made the friction possible. Doubt remained the clearest residual of all. Amina Diallo sent a brief, encrypted note months later from expanded northern plots. The extra modules continued to perform without detectable acute harm. Local cooperatives had begun saving and selecting seed on their own terms, quietly incorporating the unacknowledged traits into farmer-managed varieties. The official construct remained incomplete. The living system was already moving beyond it. She added one line: "Asterisks the children are heavier. The questions are not lighter. Asterisks." In the years that followed, the pattern KX had first noticed as a 0.0037% discrepancy propagated into adjacent domains. Orbital platforms increased their share of high-iteration synthetic biology work under corporate sovereign regimes that treated vacuum as both containment and jurisdictional convenience. Financial instruments linked to climate-resilient yields grew more sophisticated at pricing continuity and less interested in provenance. Information warfare around adaptation technologies shifted from denial to narrative management. The residual was no longer secret. It was contextualized as the unavoidable overhead of acting inside a narrowing biophysical window. New philosophies of necessary opacity circulated in policy circles and certain academic networks. Older languages of transparency and consent found themselves arguing against measurable harvests. KX continued to work, though the contracts grew narrower and the surveillance denser. He wrote less for clients and more for the distributed archive, adding layers as new platforms, new gene drives, and new quiet disappearances entered the record. He did not become a public figure. He became a persistent, low-level cost in several risk models. Curiosity had not saved the subtracted names. It had made their subtraction slightly more expensive to repeat. On a clear evening years after first discrepancy, he stood again on a waterfront. Different city, same violet haze of managed albedo and the soft mechanical sound of autonomous systems negotiating shared space. A child on a nearby path held a piece of flatbread made from the enhanced grain and tore it without ceremony. The gesture contained no knowledge of orbital thermal spikes or administrative double deaths. It contained only hunger that had been met. The ethical dilemma had not resolved. It had simply become the background condition of a civilization that could iterate life in vacuum faster than it could agree on the terms of accountability. Progress had delivered calories. It had also delivered a working demonstration that certain ledgers could be closed by force of output. KX opened the private archive one last time that night and added a final note. Asterisk the system that feeds the drying places learned to treat some lives as intermediate variables. The grain grew. The variables did not return. What we plant next will carry both facts forward. Asterisk. He closed the terminal. The question that remained was no longer whether the residual could be erased. It was whether a species that had learned to optimize an orbit would ever again accept the full cost of seeing every name that optimization required. Outside, the lights of the ordinary city continued their work. Above them, the private platforms held their orbits, iterating the next necessary refinement under the same quiet rules. The years after 2030 had not chosen between hope and fear. They had learned to grow both in the same soil.